Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, my name is Merlin Crossley. I'm Dean of the Faculty of Science here at UNSW, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you to this important event, the Risky Business Q&A. I welcome you acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Bedigal people of the Eora Nation, their elders past, present and future. Tonight is a great occasion. The science faculty at UNSW is always looking to contribute to the rational understanding of the world. Now, when my colleague here, Herbert Huppert, first suggested the topic, he explained that rather than seeing problems just as black and white issues, we should look at them in terms of risk. Take climate change. Rather than seeing it as a divisive issue, why not ask the question, do you want to risk not developing renewable energy systems? How much are you prepared to bet they won't be useful? How much would you invest in them? Every business has a risk and audit committee. Every individual assesses risk every day. So let's get used to talking about risk, and let's have scientists reaching out to business and to politicians. But first, in order to get advice on Herbert's risky venture, I went to the UNSW School of Mathematics and Statistics, and I asked them to calculate if this event was too risky. And this is what they said. They said to me, if you get a great panel, you have a 90% chance of success. So we have put together the best panel anyone could imagine. I'm grateful to have here tonight the Honourable Malcolm Turnbull, a leading politician, to have our new Vice-Chancellor, Ian Jacobs, to have the experienced businesswoman and modern intellectual, Sam Mostyn, and to Herbert himself, whom we share with Cambridge University. Herbert is a mathematical geophysicist, and when he's here, I never know whether to put him in our School of Maths, Geology, or Physics. So next, I went back to the School of Maths, and they said this panel was sensational. We have a 90% chance of success, but I wanted more certainty. And they said if I could get the world's, not Australia's, but the world's best radio science presenter, ABC's Radio National's Robyn Williams, then they said everything he does has a 90% chance of success. So I went back to the School of Maths and said, I've got the best panel, the best presenter, 90 plus 90. Do I have a 180% chance of success? And they said, no. You multiply the numbers together, your chance of success has fallen to 81%. So now I'm sharing this paradox with you. And they said, if I did that, I'd have a 90% chance of explaining the paradox. And in fact, they said my chance of making a successful event now was 90% times 90% times 90%. It had fallen to 73%. And so now I've proved it. I am someone who patently does not understand risk, and I need to listen to the panel. Everything I do has lowered our chance of success. So, without further ado, I want to call upon my ever-inspirational and tireless friend, the one and only Robyn Williams, to save the day. Thank you, Robyn.
Thank you, Merlin. He's Dean of Science, but he's also my agent, as you probably know. Indeed, a star panel. Serious part, I received the National Geographic on Monday. Its cover story is the war on science. Here is a magazine that is restrained, conservative, cautious, coming out with this. And it says, climate change does not exist. Evolution never happened. The moon landing was a fake. Vaccinations can lead to autism. Genetically modified food is evil. All those statements are 100%. There's no nuance there. And you wonder why in this age, because you see Paul Nurse, the president of the Royal Society of London, who's going to be on Life Matters on Easter Friday, by the way, brilliant man. He actually did a film on the war on science before he became president. Why is this going on? Why are people saying this is 100% wrong? Nothing is 100% wrong, as far as we can tell. Even gravity, which is keeping you in your seat. 100 years ago, Einstein wrote General Relativity to explain where we need to check a few things about gravity which we don't quite understand. This is the interesting thing about science, it's nuance. And if you look at the huge worries we have about terrorism, is it 127 people? Now, these are precious people, I'm not discounting. But the figure for falling off tractors and being run over is larger. Which is the most dangerous animal in Australia? I thought it was bees. Certainly not sharks. It's the horse. What are you going to do about assessing the risk of horse riding? These are various things to do, and of course one of the biggest problems is driving cars. Now, I happen to agree with Martin Amis, the novelist, that no young man under 30 should ever drive a car, or to some extent be let out loose on the street. It would save thousands of lives. Is this risk worthwhile? Now, the point about risk is it takes you away from the 100%ers and asks you as a citizen to make up your mind about how you may want to live with this list of things: vaccinations, climate change, and so on. Business, any number of things. And they affect not only you, they affect others, your immediate family. Now, if vaccinations get wiped, my daughter who lives near Byron and my grandsons at risk of getting disease. So what you do affects others. So risk is for you as a citizen to make up your mind how you want to act. Not just for yourself, oh, that's all wrong, but in terms of the community. Do you remember the community? It's quite a good idea, actually. And so here we are to talk about risk. There are a number of things that we're going to talk about. The way personal risk is affected. Of course, climate change comes into this, because if you simply do not do anything about climate change, there's a fair number of odds that you're in trouble, not simply as a local citizen, but across the land, across the globe. Secondly, health. Now, Philip Adams has told everyone in Australia, I'm on chemotherapy. I have a choice between going for some quality of life, which is very tempting, or do what most of the oncologists suggest, maybe you'll agree with this, Ian, an extension of lifespan. Which should you go for? It is a choice. You do it by consulting your family and friends. You're not alone in this. We'll talk about lots of things, including micro-lives. Obama apparently lost half an hour when he went to China the other day. There's a name called Spiegelhalter that you need to write down. David Spiegelhalter, one of the friends of 8 squared, Herbert Huppert. We call him 8 squared because he's a mathematician. Would you lead off the discussion, please, Herbert?
We all face risks throughout our lives, every day of our lives. Some small risks, like should we cross against the red light in order to get to the other side quickly because we see a friend we know. Some larger risks, like should we send our children to a certain school, which we've heard both good and bad things about. Financial risks, risks in jobs. Should we leave one job and take another? Should we marry one partner or not? That's an enormous risk. Sometimes we do know something quantitative about the risks, but sometimes we're just influenced by perception, which can be very different. Robyn mentioned sharks. I, and almost all Australians, are scared of sharks. There's 1 death per year on average in Australia due to shark attacks. But I drive quite happily. There are 1,000 deaths a year in Australia due to motor accidents. I should be much more nervous as far as the quantitative evaluation is concerned over driving than over sharks. But my perception often makes me think differently. There's some risks we know about, quite a bit about, motor accidents, shark attacks, burglaries, and there's some we know virtually nothing about because they happen so infrequently. Ebola outbreaks, terrorism attacks. We have to consider all of those and take them into account. And how to make a decision on risk is really one of the important matters, and I'm sure that we'll talk about that in a number of different ways. One also has to think about relative risk. Sometimes said that car travel is more dangerous than walking, is more dangerous than aircraft flight. Does that mean per journey, per mile, per hour? That's something that one has to think about frequently. What is the relative comparison that one's making? I once met an astronaut and his wife, who I didn't get on at all well with, told me after a while that I didn't treat him with sufficient respect. I didn't know what a dangerous job he had. 7 astronauts or budding astronauts had been killed in the Challenger explosion, and a number of others in the training phase. And I, because I didn't like her, said, "But madam, per passenger mile, it must be the safest way of journey." She disliked me even more after that comment. Gambling on shares or on horses or on cards is an important aspect of risk, and it's something that's been with us for a very long time. The Greeks, the Romans gambled 2,000 years ago on dice. It's really interesting that it wasn't until about 1650 that the Chevalier de Mere, an inveterate gambler, approached 2 mathematicians and basically said, I wasn't there to be sure exactly what he said, but could you please invent the idea of probability that will allow us to make assessments of gambling and how to evaluate risks? And being good mathematicians, they said yes. In those days, they could say yes without asking for a research contract, without having to fill in forms. They just invented probability theory. Now, I'd like to end this introduction in particular, because the Vice-Chancellor is a medic, by saying a few things about some of the recent ideas on medical risks and the David Spiegelhalter ideas of micromorts and microlives. First, micromort, which is what is the length in which you'd have to undertake some activity in order to have a 1 in a million chance of an accidental death. You could ride a motorbike for 10 kilometers. That costs a micromort. You could drive a car for 40 kilometers. You can go in an airplane for 40,000 kilometers. Each one of those costs 1 micromort. Giving birth in Sydney, where it's quite safe, is actually 50 micromorts. What a mathematician likes about these numbers and the idea of micromorts is they're not simply additive. As I told you, 10 kilometers on a bike is 1 micromort. Giving birth in Sydney is 50 micromorts. Giving birth on a bike is about 520,000 micromorts. Microlives is the idea that comes up from the fact that we live roughly 1.5 million hours. Wouldn't it be nice to increase those? What could we do, and how much would it increase it? Exercise, you immediately think of. 20 minutes of exercise a day is worth 1 microlife. So you live roughly half an hour a day longer if you exercise for 20 minutes. Unfortunately, this is not wonderfully proportional either. If you exercise for 2 hours, then you only live about an hour longer, but you've spent 2 of the hours exercising, so the hour a day may not be so worthwhile unless you enjoy the exercise for its exercise self. Then there's the question of 1 drink a day. That's worth 1 microlife. That extends your life by about half an hour a day. The second drink costs you a microlife. That shortens your life by half an hour a day. And just in case you see a pattern there, let me say that's wrong. It's not that the third drink increases your life again and the fourth. That's not how it works. Exercising, I've already mentioned, eating well can lead to a microlife. It's clearly well worthwhile doing things, but the only problem I have to explain to you is all that extra life, although it can be half an hour a day, an hour a day on average, comes at the end. It's a pity it doesn't come in your 21st year. You could have 1,000 days being 21. That would be worthwhile. That would be a risk worth taking.
Thank you, Herbert. Now, he mentioned David Spiegelhalter, who's, of course, Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge as well, and he's worth looking up. And Herbert, amongst many other things, led the Royal Society investigation into terrorism, etc. Sam Mostyn used to be president of the Australian Museum, worked a long time in business, especially in insurance, and does any number of things now. Sam.
Well, thank you, Robyn. And I'd just love to sit and listen to Herbert for a bit longer. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are on Gadigal land and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to thank them for their enduring hospitality and for the lessons they teach us in resilience. And I'm going to come back to resilience because I think far too often we all think about risk in the negative and we're fearful. And I think much of our concern about risk is dealt with if we could slightly change our perspective and think about resilience and how we build resilience in communities rather than the fear that risk can corrode in a community and when it becomes pervasive. And I think quite often we live in a community where fear drives our decisions, or where those around us would prefer we were in fear rather than grabbing hold of these opportunities that great moments of change present and use them to build resilient communities, resilient companies, resilient organisations, resilient families. And for that, I think we owe Indigenous Australians a great debt who continue to teach us about resilience at great odds. And our great risk at the moment, I think, is we will miss an opportunity to recognise Indigenous Australians in our Constitution, which again is a matter for our resilience and our well-being into the future together with Indigenous Australians. So that's how I think about risk. But today I was preparing to come here, but I had 2 hours in a banking headquarters. I'm on a board of a bank, and we had 2 hours as a board sitting across the table from the leading prudential regulators, APRA, and we had 2 hours discussing risk. And we started with capital risk, market risk, operational risk, and we finally got to this topic of risk culture. And the conversation suddenly took hold, and we realised that all this risk that surrounds us, the inadequate pricing of risk in markets, the things that create bubbles, the things that cause great angst and concern for people looking at a system that seems like it may break at some time because we're all doing so well and we don't quite see what the consequences are going to be, we got into risk culture. And we were discussing the quality and calibre of the board. Were we properly understanding the risk that we were taking on behalf of customers and people investing in the bank? But more importantly, could we convince APRA that the people in the organisation, the people who deal with customers, were not taking inappropriate risks? Were they people who could actually execute using intelligent responses to risk? Could they show judgment that was based in ethics and good values? Now, most of you would say, I don't believe banks do that. But my experience is when you get into a discussion about risk of that level and you have a regulator speaking to you at the highest level, you are immediately in the state of human risk. And you're talking about what do all of us do when we're faced with decisions, often when no one is looking. How do we behave when there aren't all structures around us holding us to account? How do we behave as decent human beings? And it reminded me that the last time I thought really deeply about risk in a corporate sense was when I worked at Australia's largest insurance company, Insurance Australia Group, back in the early 2000s. And climate change was just emerging as an issue. Our actuaries, who are brilliant mathematicians, like Herbert, who I never understood until we started talking about climate change, and they were telling us that the actuarial forecasts on climate change risk for Australia, the region, the world, were reaching a point where if we did nothing, we would be facing catastrophic events on a more regular basis. And they weren't alarmist about it, they weren't extreme about it. I can promise you, if there are actuaries here tonight, I say this with the greatest respect, actuaries are not alarmists. They work with data. They work, like Herbert does, with the maths of a situation and probability. And so we spoke to our actuaries and realised that as a large insurance company, we had to be in the debate about climate change. And it was most unexpected because insurance companies, at that time, HIH had just collapsed. I think everyone hated insurers. They thought we were rapacious profit makers. But in fact, what we wanted to do was help reduce risk. And so in the process of engaging with climate change, we engaged with scientists. We just didn't rely on a corporate view. We engaged with scientists. The Wentworth group of concerned scientists joined us. We worked with great scientists at the CSIRO. And then we reached out to other companies from all different sectors, not just insurance, but reinsurance, oil and gas, the banking sector, recyclers. We went for a broad group of people and companies and leaders who we thought shared a view about addressing this risk and being leaders and helping a community to reduce that risk. We also were brought together by a wonderful Australian, Don Henry. Don was leading the ACF, an environmentalist. And Don, working with 6 chief executives and scientists, helped us create the Australian Roundtable on Climate Change back in 2004-05. And that group of people, representing their very big companies in Australia, recommended an emission trading system. And it actually got some traction at the time. Well, at the time, it was a Conservative Prime Minister who accepted that the time was right for an ETS. John Howard actually believed that because business had said, actually, this risk is real. We're not being alarmists, but the flip side is we're not taking advantage of the opportunities if we get ahead of this, if we get into everything that the climate change debate will help us be better as a nation, better as a community. And the employees of the companies involved in this program were enlivened by the fact that no longer were they involved in corporates and had to defend the idea of profit and all the things that people often chat about when you reveal you work for a large company. They could talk about the fact that their companies were working on policy to help governments understand that there was a collective view that we could act on climate change. Now, sadly, the politics got in the way, and I'm sure Malcolm will talk about politics, and it was a difficult time, but a group of people did stand up and put risk in its context. And the risk it was put in, the way that context worked was we're going to build a resilient Australia using a pricing mechanism to actually change behaviour and to see a shift that would put us in advance of many. And we can debate later, Malcolm, whether we were too early and whether it would have been uncompetitive for us to do that as a nation against others not moving. But today, we've got China and the United States who've formed an agreement on a pricing regime of sorts in the future. At the end of the year in Paris, governments will come together and discuss this. And there'll also be a discussion about the Sustainable Development Goals and the place of climate change as one of the drivers of global change and risk sitting in our system. So I thought I'd just use that as an example. There are many others I can use, but the only way we were able to come to a wise decision to communicate that risk as an opportunity for the country was that we reached out to people we hadn't spoken to before. We reached out to scientists and we trusted the scientists. We listened to them. We often didn't understand what they were trying to tell us, but we found a way to communicate and to collaborate, and we taught some of the scientists things about the market and about pricing and about what companies can do and what consumers can do when they have the right information. So we partnered, and to have an environmentalist and the ACF sitting behind us as well meant that business and the environment was very, very happy to sit together to help solve this very big issue. So my final point, I guess, is, and it's a long way to get to this point, I guess, is that we're only going to solve the big risk issues if we take a resilience focus, if we engage with people we haven't yet spoken to that will help us understand the magnitude of the risk and the complexity of the risk, apply the resilience frame, and we'll only do that if there are diverse people involved in the conversation. So I see that in the context of gender. Women must be at the table where decisions are made. Women should be in the parliament. Women should be leading companies. They've got to be in the debate because we cannot afford, with the risks around us and the opportunity for our resilience, to waste 50% of our talent. nor should we ignore people who come from different cultural backgrounds with different experiences, or different learning experiences, different life experiences, whether it's scientists, mathematicians, physicists, whoever they are, we should be talking, and we're not at the moment. I think we've fallen back because we're frightened of risk, we're scared. We've gone back to a lot of silo-based thinking and protecting ourselves and hiding from risk. And I think if we just reached out, if we learnt to collaborate, we thought about risk as an opportunity for resilience and resilience building, and engaged the full capacity of our communities, risk would be one of the greatest prompts to a brighter future and relieve us of our fear. Thanks.
Thanks, Sam. Malcolm, your risky thoughts.
Thanks, Robyn. This is the most excitingly disruptive, intriguingly subversive time to be alive. We are going through a period of the most rapid change in human history. We have never seen changes of the scale that we're seeing today. In our own lifetimes, in a generation, we've seen hundreds of millions of people pulled out of poverty. We've seen China go from being less than 5% of the global economy to be the world's largest economy. The old order is changing with a rapidity that we've never known before. And threaded through all of that is uncertainty. Uncertainty is another way of describing risk. What is the risk? That I will lose money in my investment. What is the risk? That the shark will eat me when I swim in the beach tomorrow morning. There's a degree of uncertainty. We have never had so much uncertainty in our economic, our geopolitical environment. It's full of uncertainty, and it's driven, of course, in large measure by the rapidity of technological change. I mean, think of this. Already today, most of us in the developed world are connected to the internet 24/7, at least through a smart device, a smartphone typically, or a tablet or other devices. Probably, if you're like most of us, multiple devices. It won't be long before most people in the whole world are connected like that. It won't be long before most things in the world are connected to each other. The Internet of Things, every light bulb, every door, every car will be filled with hundreds of microprocessors. There are dozens there already. All of this is rapidly changing our world. There is so much exciting technology around us, and it's transforming the world in which we live in. So that gives us great uncertainty, and people are threatened by that. Big corporate empires are shaken to the core. Banks get worried about what is going to happen with peer-to-peer lending using online platforms. Great newspaper companies are brought down by the power of the internet, as indeed are television broadcasters and all these other platforms. So there's enormous change. Now, how do we cope with that? How do we cope with that as citizens, as businesses, in my case, as politicians? The answer is that we cannot run away from risk or uncertainty. We cannot be afeared of it. We have to embrace volatility. We have to ensure that we are always as agile and flexible as we can. We have to be, as Nicholas Nassim Taleb said, we have to be anti-fragile, in the sense that we are strengthened by volatility because nimble, agile, able to maintain the maximum optionality at all time, we can take advantage of rapid changes. You know, people sometimes say, people sometimes come to Canberra, business people actually have to say, Sam, and they say, we just want certainty. And I always say, well, you've come to the wrong place. And they say, what, do you mean Canberra? I said, no, planet Earth. Wrong planet, sorry. We are living in an inherently uncertain environment. But I think the key is being able to manage that. And that means that we shouldn't imagine that the way we did things yesterday is the way we should do them tomorrow. We've got to be prepared to review our approach to
business to policies in politics, for example, all the time on the basis of the evidence and experience. So if a politician like me, a cabinet minister, has a new policy and a journalist says, "Minister, will you guarantee that your new plan for XYZ will be successful?" The answer is not to fall into the trap and say, "Oh yes, I guarantee that." The truthful answer, the wise answer, is to say, this is, based on what we know, the best policy that we have available. But there are no guarantees, and we are going to see how it goes, watch it very carefully, and we will learn, and we may well improve it. It may get better. We may want to roll it out into other areas, or it may not work, and we may lead us to do something else. And, you know, most people understand that. Most people will give you a head nod for that. So embracing volatility and flexibility is critically important, because that is how you manage risk. You see, everyone assesses risk in different ways. I mean, Herbert talked about sharks, and so it was you, Robyn. You talked about sharks and horses, and you said that horses are more dangerous than sharks. Well, that is true in the sense that more people are injured by horses than sharks. But having said that, I think that if you limited the two comparative samples to the universe of people that had been, say, stroking sharks and stroking horses, I think you would find that the shark strokers would be more at risk. Inspecting a shark's teeth, which I think was much more risky than inspecting a horse's teeth. And of course, riding sharks is not something I would recommend any of you try at home. So we've got to, you know, we talk about risk in these ways, we've got to assess very carefully. It's like driving. Driving is no doubt, you know, more dangerous than flying in an aeroplane. Well, that may be because, although we have had that tragic accident in Europe just in the last few days, but there's no doubt that more people on any view are killed in car accidents than on aeroplanes. Well, that's probably because the people that fly aeroplanes are well-trained, sober, and are not doing crazy things. If you mitigate your risk by driving sober and driving in accordance with the traffic rules, then your risk will be much less. So we've got to be very careful how we assess it. But I think the key thing is to recognise we live in an uncertain and volatile environment, recognise that it offers more opportunities than challenges, recognise that if you are agile, flexible, and in terms of Australia's future, what does that mean? That means we have to be smarter, more competitive, more productive, more technologically sophisticated, better informed by science. And if we equip ourselves in that way, both as governments, as individuals, as businesses, then all of that volatility becomes your friend, not your foe. So I say risky business is good business if you are equipped to handle it. And you're equipped to handle it by being agile and smart and flexible and making decisions in a way that don't disrespect that uncertainty, that don't say, here is my decision, this is our policy, this is our plan, and it's going to be like that forever. Rather than doing that, recognise that every step you take is a step of learning. It's an exploration, if you like, into that uncertain world. And as you progress, as long as you maintain your flexibility and your ability to move one way or the other, depending on the circumstances, you will find that you can take advantage of the volatility rather than be threatened by it.
Thank you, Minister. And thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for waiting so patiently as our host. I mentioned cancer in the beginning. Of course, this is your field, particularly those cancers affecting women. So please, risk.
Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here and to welcome you to UNSW as the new President and Vice-Chancellor. I've been in post for 7 weeks now. I've been spending a lot of time in that 7 weeks thinking about risk. It's a highly intense time when you take on a job like this. I've arrived from the UK, so my first concern about risk was, will I understand the Australian sense of humour? The answer is no. And I then very quickly had to worry about, will our 52,000 students turn up at UNSW? Fortunately, I was assured it was a low risk and nothing went wrong. I've been worrying about the likelihood that we will get a Nobel Prize. Will the likelihood, the risk of losing some of our very best academics, all sorts of risks related to the university. I have, of course, been worrying about the risk that we won't get a really good settlement in higher education funding in Australia, and many, many other risks related to higher education. But when I was thinking about this evening, I thought I'd retreat to another area that I've been heavily involved in, and that is medical and health risk. And I thought I'd just introduce that into these discussions. I should say that the other risk that I'm fundamentally concerned about this evening is that my voice will eventually give up. I have a sore throat, so forgive me if I start to wane towards the end of this discussion. Medical and health risk. We are in, as Malcolm said, we're at an extraordinary age. There is a mass of medical technology now available to us. There are new medical techniques that are now mainstream: genetics, proteomics, imaging, methods of gaining information in medicine that we wouldn't have dreamed of even 10 years ago, that are now mainstream. Those methods and the treatments that follow from them and the preventative opportunities that provides create some real challenges. How do we deal with the understanding we have of risk of disease? Do people really want to know about their risk of disease? What about the risks of acting on the basis of the risk of disease? Preventative strategies. What about the risks of vaccination, immunization? What about the risks related to the new drugs that we're introducing? How do we make those risks? How much do we let people in the general public, individual people, make decisions about risk? How paternalistic should the medical and health professions be? And I was thinking about how to illustrate these risks, and I had a stroke of luck in a way, because many of you, I'd be interested to see a show of hands from those of you who have seen the media coverage of Angelina Jolie's decision to have her ovaries removed because of her risk of ovarian cancer. Just about everyone. A massive amount of media publicity about this issue, which is an important issue, but perhaps you wouldn't have come across before. The reason Angelina Jolie was able to make that decision is because she was able to have a blood test because of her family history, a blood test for a gene, two genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2, which predisposed to breast and ovarian cancer. She was found to have a mutation, an abnormality of that gene, which leads to up to an 80% risk of breast cancer and up to about a 45% risk of ovarian cancer. She had a bilateral mastectomy, I think about 2 years ago, and she more recently made a decision to also have her ovaries out to deal with that risk. Dealing with that sort of information is massively challenging. It was relatively easy for her to decide to have her ovaries removed. She had possibly a 45% lifetime risk of developing ovarian cancer, a disease for which the 5-year survival rates are only about 40%. But there was nevertheless a risk. There she was, healthy, making a decision to have her ovaries removed. The risk of the surgery she had was small, but it wasn't negligible. There was a significant risk related to the surgery. She will have had to make decisions about what to do in terms of managing without the hormones that her ovaries produce. Is there a risk to her of cardiovascular disease? Is there a risk to her of bone disease? Can that risk be mitigated by taking hormone replacement therapy? And what are the risks to her of taking hormone replacement therapy, given that she was at risk of breast cancer? Were there alternatives to having surgery to have her ovaries removed? There are screening tests that one could use. What is the likelihood of those screening tests being effective? What are the risks of those screening tests? There are false positive rates of the screening tests. Were there any drugs she could have taken, and what are the risks of those drugs? There are masses of issues, and of course, it's relatively easy for women. It's difficult to know that you have a BRCA1 or 2 mutation, and you have a very high risk of breast or ovarian cancer, but at least then you know the risk is high, and that brings some certainty about your decision-making process. What if you have a weak family history of breast and ovarian cancer, and your risk is only 10%, as opposed to 45%, compared to the lifetime risk for women in the general population of 1%. What about women who have a risk of just 1%, but they say, I don't want to have a risk of 1% of ovarian cancer. I would like to have my ovaries removed. What is the risk of the surgery to remove the ovaries? Is that something that the medical and healthcare professions should be considering and adopting? How do we explain these sort of risks to people in the general population as we get more and more complex and sophisticated information about the risk of disease? How do we take account of the psychological factors? Many women in this situation are very concerned about their risk of ovarian cancer, even though it's very low, because their neighbor got ovarian cancer, or because their second cousin got ovarian cancer, even though that doesn't increase their risk very much. So I think there are fantastic opportunities in medicine and health related to all of this new information that we have, but it creates some fascinating and challenging decision-making processes that face individual people and the medical and health professions. And I wonder if that's something we might want to discuss during the rest of this evening.
Thank you, Ian. Could you just clarify one point, compared to lung cancer and breast cancer, which are the two most common cancers affecting women, how does ovarian cancer compare? Is it more cryptic? Is it more hidden? Is it difficult to spot?
Ovarian cancer is difficult in that it isn't diagnosed until it's at a relatively advanced stage. So it's similar to lung cancer in that context. The outcome of treatment is poor, not as bad as the outcome of treatment of lung cancer, but only about 40% of women who develop ovarian cancer will be alive and well 5 years later. But in the context of breast cancer, survival rates 5 years later are 80 or 90%. So the risk, interpreting the risk of ovarian cancer, I think this is probably what you're alluding to, in interpreting the risk, you also have to take into account the risk of dying from the disease at some point in the future. Of course, the decisions that women are making about preventative strategies, they're making at a time when they're perfectly well. So they're balancing the very, very small risk of surgery going wrong against a much longer-term risk of getting a very serious disease which may kill them.
Thank you. Anyone else want to pick up a point that's made by someone else?
Could I say something, continue what Sam said so nicely about fear and resilience, the opposite of that. I was the chair of a working group preparing a report on terrorism, or how to use science against terrorism, to be more explicit. One of the things we highlighted in the report was the greatest fear of terrorism was fear itself. And we were nervous, the first publication of our report, that we felt that the President of the United States, who's meant to calm down the country, was actually building up fear and making them more fearful of terrorism. When we launched the report, we made this very clear, and I said to the newspapers that were there, could you please really downplay the fear aspect? And they looked at me and said, but you don't seem to understand, Professor Huppert, that's what sells newspapers. We want to increase the fear. And I thought that was a terrifying statement, but...
You know, I think we've had a lesson in front of us over the course of the last week with the passing of Malcolm Fraser. I was watching, as many of you would have, George Megalogenis's interview with Malcolm Fraser, I think on Sunday night, where they were discussing the decision to invite tens of thousands of Vietnamese people to join this country after the Vietnam War. And I was thinking about the way he talked about that in a generous spirit and talked about how it would be wonderful for Australia. It wasn't just about making reparation, it was actually building a great nation. And he talked further about how wonderful the multicultural nature of Australia has benefited from that decision and from subsequent decisions about migration and immigration and refugees. And yet today, if you compare that to how fearful communities are about boat people or about our borders. And I know it's a difficult issue politically,
Sam,
but
I don't,
but no,
Sam,
let me finish.
honestly,
No, let me finish.
no, it's
Let
not.
me finish. No, let me finish.
It's not a difficult, but
No, can I just finish? Can I just
the
finish?
Australian public are not frightened
No, can I
of
just
boats.
finish? No,
Sam, you finish.
I was reminded of a conversation we could be having. That's all.
Yeah,
That we
okay.
could be having a conversation based in opportunities of, and these are difficult challenges. And I'm not making a political statement. It's simply, as a community, I think many people have been encouraged to be fearful because you then support policies that say we behave in a certain way. And I just, but it's not. I was struck by the humanity of the conversation. It was a generous one, and it must have been taken at a time when people were worried about people arriving. And I would love us to have a bipartisan discussion about that. I know it's tough, but it's...
Well, no, but hang on, but it's not tough. I mean, Malcolm Fraser was a Liberal Prime Minister. He was the first leading politician that we know of, or at least I know of, certainly the first cabinet minister, to have spoken positively about multiculturalism, which he did in 1969, which was, 4 years before Al Grasby and so forth. I mean, Malcolm came across as a, this rather stiff, tall, austere, Western Districts farmer, very Melbourne establishment, but he had very, very strong, generous, liberal instincts and values. Yep. And that was seen very much in his approach to immigration. I mean, you have to, without introducing a partisan note into this, the Labor government led by Gough Whitlam was very opposed to Vietnamese immigration, no doubt for political reasons, but the fact is it was Fraser, this conservative establishment figure, who facilitated it. I think I'd just say a couple of things about fear, though. Look, fear is a very big emotion. It is an emotion. Human beings are not entirely rational. This is why the rational markets theory is nonsense, because markets are determined by decisions made by human beings, and human beings are not always rational. Keynes very wisely observed that the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. This is very good warning to anybody who sees something as overvalued, whether it's a share or a currency or a commodity, and decides to be a short seller. And before, if the market continues, they might be right. It might be overvalued, but at some point they might run out of money. Now, as far as fear is concerned, though, I think that it is absolutely critical. It's a critical responsibility of governments not to promote fear, and in fact, particularly in the face of terrorism, which is a real threat. It's not, we're not kidding ourselves about that. But we've got to recognise that what the terrorist wants to do, terrorist wants to frighten us. So fear is the outcome the terrorist wants. That's terrorism is the propaganda of the deed. They want to frighten us and make us go about our lives in a very different way. So it's very important to be strong, to be united, and not to be frightened. And the truly inspiring way this country, and this city of Sydney in particular, pulled together after the Lindt Cafe siege was remarkable. This was a city that came together with a practical solidarity founded in love, not in fear. And that was exactly the right response. That is exactly the opposite of what the terrorists want. Now, the other thing terrorists want to do is they want to divide the community. The tactic of the terrorist is always to try to get the majority, the government, the host community, whatever you want to call it, the mainstream, to turn on a particular group. And, David Kilcullen, the great Australian expert in counterinsurgency and so forth, has written about how this operates in Afghanistan. His book, The Accidental Terrorist. And this is why it's very important, again, for us as a government, as we react to terrorism, terrorism that is conducted in the name, so the terrorists claim, of Islam, to remember that what they want us to do is to turn on people of Islamic faith. And in fact, we have to do the absolute opposite. We have to make sure that everybody of Islamic faith or Islamic background or tradition understands that they are part of Australia and they are part of our national solidarity, and that the terrorist effort to split them off and split us off from them is going to be frustrated. So fear, you know, we have to remember, fear is overwhelmingly the tool of our enemies. Our response has to be one of calm, of confidence, of competence. It's important that the public knows that the government knows what it's doing, and that's why it's vital that our security agencies, our police are professional and well-trained and well-resourced, as they are. They need to know that we have the means to keep the country safe. But above all, we need to be responsible and united. And fear is what our enemies, those who hate our way of life, want to imbue in us, and it's something that we should always resist.
Malcolm, one question. How do you manage this absence of fear? How do you deal with the age of uncertainty when many media, many newspapers, print what they bloody well like and say almost anything about any aspect of what you just said? How do you deal with that?
Well, the reality is that you know, we have a free press, and I have to say I agree with Churchill that complaining about the press, or the media, I would say, in the modern world, is about as productive as complaining about the weather. So we have a free and diverse media, but the good thing is that we all, particularly people in my line of work, have got plenty of avenues to express themselves. And of course the internet being this Uber platform to which we all have access to, gives us an access to go beyond the media. You see, if you go back 20 years, certainly, someone in my line of work, if I was traduced in a newspaper, I would, you know, someone had written some terrible thing about me, I would have to grovel to the editor and say, oh, will you please let me write a counterblast? And he would say, no, you can have a letter, no more than one paragraph, and it'll be on the bottom right-hand corner and on the edition that nobody reads. And, you know, you had no recourse. Nowadays, of course, we have access, whether it is just through your own blogs or Facebook or whatever. You've got enormous access, and of course there is so much more diverse. I mean, our media has never been more diverse or more competitive than it is today. So I think what's happened is that we used to have a world where there were a number of very powerful media channels, television channels, radio stations, newspapers typically. That is now utterly changed, and I think yes, it's not as ordered as it used to be. Yes, there's a lot of unruly, uninformed, extreme sometimes opinion floating around, but boy, I would rather have that than the alternative. As I always say to people who want me to, as Communications Minister, to do something about bias on the ABC, I always remind them that Vladimir Putin's methods of media management are no more admirable than his foreign policy.
I want to ask Sam something you talked about before, and that is collaboration and interaction. Now, Catherine Livingstone, who's the president of the Business Council of Australia, has pointed out so many times how low we are in the interaction between business people and scientists. And, well, is it necessary? You know, are scientists still stuck in the 1950s thinking anyone who's in business got to be a shark, and vice versa, people in science take 5 years to do anything? You know, what is the blockage?
It does require generosity on both sides, or all sides. And I think it's no accident that Catherine is also president of the Australian Museum, and Kim McKay, who's the chief executive of the Australian Museum, is here as well. So the science connection to business and to leadership is very important in this country. It's vital. But I do think we allow ourselves to get stuck in our comfort zones, our industries of comfort. And I've met scientists who absolutely hate the free market, hate capitalism, hate the idea that people take some pride in working for large corporations or building small businesses. And I meet business people all the time who've never really sat down and had an engaging conversation, a stimulating conversation with a Herbert and actually been challenged by it. So I think we have got to learn to open ourselves up to being challenged and to challenge our own preconceptions about where people come from. And that's as I said earlier, it's a gender issue, it's a cultural issue, it's about how we actually respect one another. And I think too many of these binary issues, that business versus science, business against climate change, business you can have business but you can't solve poverty. These things are misnomers. If we could actually find it in ourselves, and I think it's at all levels. That's what I look for in great leadership, is leaders who actually say, I've learnt something from someone quite unexpected today, because I've allowed someone who had something I've never thought about to inform my view, my worldview. And we don't do it enough, and I think it's one of the great things we could do in this country. We've got some of the greatest scientists, medical scientists, across the screen. We've got CSIRO has been one of the great enduring triumphs of Australia, and I think everyone would agree. And so we've got to be a bit humble about this. And I say that as someone who has been lucky to traverse business and sport. And people ask me why I can be interested in arts and sport. They say you can't possibly love the arts and love sport. Well, actually, I love great entertainment. I love a spectacle, and I find the same people sitting in the front of operas and theatre as I do at the footy. And we've just got to actually be a bit generous with one another and
It's interesting, yes.
do it well.
Robyn, can I come in on that?
Please, Ian.
I'm very excited that issue of science and business has come up. And I'm bringing this back to risk. I think that one of the risks for Australia is that we don't get right the connection between government, industry, and our universities. There's a lot of talk in Australia at the moment about austerity. One of the ways out of austerity is by driving the discovery, knowledge, application pipeline. That needs really, really top quality partnership between government, industry and universities. Our universities are producing wonderful discovery work across Australia. If we can harness that, pick the discoveries that are ripe for application, drive it through in partnership with industry, with support from government, the future and the opportunities for diversifying the Australian economy to get beyond a mineral-based economy are absolutely enormous, and that's something that I'd very much like to see happen over the next few years.
Well, can I reinforce what the Vice-Chancellor has said? We will not be able to maintain our standard of living, our position as a prosperous, high-wage, generous social welfare net society unless we are more innovative, more creative in this increasingly competitive global environment. And that requires all of the things that you've said. And just this week, I'll bring you 2 bits of good news from Canberra. You'd be amazed. You'd be amazed I could bring you 1, I'm sure, but I'll bring you 2. And there was 1 bit of good news, which is that we have introduced the legislation this week to change the law on employee share schemes and employee options. The previous government had, and they acknowledge it was a terrible mistake now, but in 2009, they basically made it impossible to give employees shares or options, even in startup companies. And we lost a lot of new businesses, particularly in the technology area, to the west coast of the United States, because obviously the best way, particularly if you're short of money, to reward your bright young people or bright not so young people is to give them a stake in the business. And this was rendered impossible. So we're correcting that now, and the bill is in the House, and I'm sure we'll sail through both chambers with great enthusiasm. But the other thing that was he said that could be famous last word. But the other thing that was very inspiring was that my colleague on the Liberal side, Tony Smith, and the member for Griffith, Labor member Terry Butler, who succeeded Kevin Rudd, formed today, with Tony as chair and Terry as deputy chair, a parliamentary Friends of Innovation. And the aim was to have a parliamentary group, a bipartisan group, that would bring people in the startup sector, in the world of innovation, into the parliament to tell their stories, to acquaint members of parliament and, of course, the media, who are there en masse, with the great opportunities we have from being an innovative nation. And I spoke at it, and Ed Husick, who's a Labor member, spoke at it. And, you know, I'm sure that Labor and Liberal will always approach this in slightly different ways. But the more solidarity we have on being committed to ensuring that Australia is at every step more innovative, better able to link the great work you do at your university here, Vice-Chancellor, with industry, so these great ideas don't either lie, you know, gathering dust in, you know, in a laboratory or a lecture hall, but can be commercialised, can create jobs, can create opportunities. All of that is terrifically important, and I think so. I think on both fronts, on both with the law, the legislation side, and on the more political side, I think we finished our pre-budget sessions with some good news.
Malcolm, I'm delighted to hear that approach and ethos. And if we can really harness the discovery science in the universities, link it with industry and with government, that would be fantastic. It does, of course, it would be remiss of me not to highlight the need for increased investment in research in our universities, because it's that's going to drive the discovery pipeline. I know that there is real concern about that around the country at the moment. I think part of it is universities and business and government explaining to the public the importance of investing in research in our universities. That's part of the answer to this.
Could I cut across this, meaning that part of what I say will be in agreement with what you've been putting forward, some of it will be against it, or at right angles to it, which is to say, I think one does have to realise that there are differences between science and industrial people and business, but they would both benefit enormously from getting to know each other better and knowing what the aims are of the other people. I agree totally with the statement that Australia has a lot to offer scientifically and industrially, but the connection between scientists and industry is not as good, nowhere near as good as it is in Britain, and nowhere near as good in Britain as it is in America. America benefits enormously from industry very quickly going to university scientists, getting their opinion, and I think this is an important point. If the opinion is not worthwhile, they get rid of them quickly also. There's no keeping them on. In Britain, if I may say, there's too much keeping on and not enough approach.
I'm not going to defend Britain and industry or the British sense of humour tonight, I promise you.
And Australia, it would be wonderful to hear, Minister, as you said, that there has to be more involvement, and I've written a lot about this, of government in getting the universities going, and the Vice-Chancellor is absolutely correct. This is where I'm going totally parallel. There are lots of opportunities here at the University
You said you were going at right angles. So
no, I said partly. I was going to cross-cut, so partly parallel, partly...
You're only being partly orthogonal, is that right?
No, no. What I'm saying is that the points that some of you...
Semi-orthogonal contribution.
I'm not being allowed to finish. I'm saying that some of the points you're making are correct, but not all of them.
Stop having fun. Now we'll have a first question here with the microphone. No soliloquies and no party politics.
If the University of New South Wales divests itself from holdings in fossil fuel companies, it runs the risk that it will obtain a lesser return on its money and do less of the good things it does. If, on the other hand, it does not divest, there's a risk that the enlightened institutions such as this one could have given an example, and there's a risk that there will be not enough institutions divesting themselves of fossil fuels. And consequently, you might have a 2 to 6 degrees increase in temperature this century, 17 to 24 degrees in temperature by the end of the millennium. Would you be willing to ask the excellent department of mathematics, for which Professor Huppert can attest, to do a risk analysis for us?
Vice-Chancellor, this is your area.
There was one risk bigger than losing my voice completely and coming on this event tonight, and that was that someone would ask me about disinvestment in fossil fuels. But I'm delighted to talk about it. The UNSW, like most of the universities in Australia, is absolutely committed to contributing to overcoming the challenges of climate change, to finding renewable forms of energy, And we have massive amounts of work going on in solar energy and photovoltaics. We're absolutely committed to making that happen. We are also absolutely committed to being an open forum for discussion and debate about the grand challenges that face society, and climate change is certainly one of them, and it's a massive, massive concern. Equally, a university is not a place that is takes a political position or a campaigning position. So my view is that our university will do everything it can through education, through research, through the way it behaves, to contribute to overcoming the problems of climate change, to moving towards renewable energies, and be a forum for discussion, debate, and policy formulation. But we will not be a political or campaigning organisation on this issue.
Anyone else dare?
Well, can I add one controversial statement? Sorry. One slightly controversial statement, but I think it is interesting. Australia puts 1% of the carbon dioxide emissions of the world into the atmosphere. 1% is really rather small. If it stopped all its emissions, that wouldn't do much. On the other hand, the carbon dioxide emissions that go into the atmosphere from fossil fuels that started in Australia, coal that's exported, is 4.3%. Now that 4.3% number is interesting, one, because it's still slightly small, but bigger than 1%, but two, it shows how important financially the selling of fossil fuels is to Australia. So it's very easy to talk about it if you're not looking at what it means to the Australian economy, and I think that's an important matter.
Can I add one thought for you on this? Because I think the divestment movement is on. There is a big campaign globally. It's an important one to understand, and it comes from a point of deep concern for the issues that you raised. But I do think something else is coming faster, and that is the realisation by large organisations that do have deep investments and commitment to fossil fuels, that the days of actually that being a profitable market are coming towards an end. It may not be as fast as some want, but there are people looking at markets now saying the switch to renewables, the switch to battery technology, this now is happening at such a rapid speed that the boardrooms I sit in, with people thinking very, very strongly about the economics of this situation and the financial risk that sits in stranded assets, has now taken hold, and people who are sometimes regarded as climate skeptics are now looking at their portfolios and the businesses they're in. And you're hearing from captains of industry who I think 5 years ago would have said that everything was fine for a long time to come, who are no longer having that view. There was an energy analyst in the UK who a couple of weeks ago said that we'll get to a point very soon, in the next decade, when oil at $10 a barrel will be uncompetitive with solar energy. That's an extraordinary thing to happen in such a rapid time frame. And I think if you got to know some of the people in those industries, they are struggling with the very challenge that we all have, is how do we move to this new world and do it in the least risky way, but they're becoming very conscious of that that extraordinary community global issue that we all face about our responsibility. But I think you'll find there are more and more people inside those companies who have fossil fuel investments who are beginning to think very differently than they might have even 5 years ago. So I have some hope that the economics of this, and of course, if the China-US pricing mechanism and the trading scheme eventuates, the cost of carbon will actually resettle a lot of markets, and we'll see a transition. And I think the technology is just waiting for the price signals. So I think that's another way of looking at it.
Woman there.
Thanks for tonight's talk. Probably many of you are aware of Natalie Walker and Inside Policy that has brought out a great series of conversations this week around impact investment, where investments are looking at longer term impact that not only measure the financial returns but the social, economic, when we're talking here about scientists and everyone, business people getting together. So I'm really interested with the wonderful panel we have here to hear what are your views or thoughts around impact investment, where we're actually not only looking at financial return, but we're looking at it's a real game changer in terms of also measuring health outcomes, social impact, and all the rest of it. So I guess in my clumsy way, I'm saying, what are your thoughts?
I'm happy to have a go. It's part of a continuum of a new way of thinking about what we invest in and how we measure success, and what is profit and what is return. It's interesting that many entrepreneurs, the entrepreneurs that Malcolm spoke about, actually use impact investing as the way that they will make money and invest in communities as part of their philosophy. Many of them register as B corporations. It's a new phenomenon here, but well known in the United States, where the directors of those companies actually have an obligation to think about the broader societal and environmental impacts of their actions, unlike fiduciary duties that can constrain boards in other forms of corporate life. So impact investing, shared value, the move from CSR to sustainability to these new methods, I think you're seeing a significant shift. And I think people want to see purpose in the profit they make. And these are using fantastic business models to measure that and be accountable for investments in community. That's where social bonds are coming from. It's where green bonds are coming from. And I think it's a wonderful merger of intent and purpose and profitability.
Malcolm, do you want to say?
Yeah, look, I think, firstly, institutions and individuals should be free to invest in whatever they like, so they can make, they can make their own choices. As far as the first point that was asked of the Vice-Chancellor, in terms of the combating climate change and moving to a low-emission economy globally, probably by far the most valuable work the University of New South Wales does is in its exercise, in its research and discovery in terms of clean energy. And of course, it is a world leader in solar technology. And there is, coupled with battery technology, the problem with solar, and you can make the same point about wind, of course. The wind isn't blowing all the time, the sun isn't shining all the time. How do you store it? And storage has always been the big conundrum with energy. And as battery technology gets better and better, that is going to be a huge. I talked about disruption earlier. That is a gigantic disruption. But anyway, so I think the Vice-Chancellor's, I agree with him in his observations about that. In terms of investing or impact investing or ethical investing, I think there's a lot to be said, and this university again has had quite a big role here with Michael Trail's leadership and Robin Crawford's leadership, for example, in investing in what you could call social entrepreneurship. And you look at the way a combination of not-for-profits and in commercial investors, financial investors, got together to buy the bulk of the childcare centres that belong to ABC Learning, the big childcare company that went bust. And that is now, of course, Good Start. And that has been a really great success. And I know Robin Crawford, who is the chairman of Good Start, was awarded an honorary doctorate at this university. And this is a very, very interesting area. And you're dead right. It used to be thought that you either invested on the basis that all you're interested in was your return, and it didn't matter what you're investing in, it was just all about the numbers. On the other hand, there was philanthropy where you wrote a check and gave it to a good cause. But in the middle is this sort of social entrepreneurship, or social investment, and I think it has enormous potential. And I just want to commend UNSW. You can't take credit for it. You weren't here when all this started.
I'm always happy.
But you can just bathe. You can just bathe in the achievements of your predecessors.
That's the skill of great leadership.
It is. Exactly. It is. You just slid in. That's right.
You do get out here.
That's right. We stand on the shoulders of giants. But anyway, I'm not sure that Fred Hilmer would like you standing on his shoulders. But nonetheless, the UNSW has done a great job in that area. I think this is a very interesting field. But it's happening. I mean, so many of these changes, but the universities and business and the issues you raised, and you're dead right. I don't think our universities are anything like as good as American universities. I think that's partly because they lack independence. I think they're just too much sort of wings of the state, if you like. They lack that independence and autonomy that the American university system has. But one of the big change that you need is actually cultural. This is the thing that we overlook all the time, is the importance of changing the culture of organisations. How do you drive out a blame culture? How do you stop an organisation having a culture where the penalties for something not working are very high and the rewards for something working are very low, so that the rational actor manages upwards? How do you encourage people to be entrepreneurial? How do you stamp out deference? I always say deference is death if you want to succeed. You've got to have people, you've got to have a team that challenges you all the time. These are big cultural changes, and that is really the key to what you're talking about. It's the key to what you were talking about in terms of entrepreneurship. It's the key to what I'm talking about in terms of flexibility. And governments can't legislate for that.
Can I go over there with check shirt?
I started thinking about it yesterday when there's an interview of the person who invented the black box flight recorder. He was working as a fuel technologist with the old Department of Aviation, and he saw in his investigation, he saw the advantages of, he got himself a tape recorder basically, he saw the advantages that this may bring to civil aviation of recording what happened on an aircraft. He developed this, but was constantly being badgered that this was going to be of no use. Eventually he ended up only by when a visitor from the UK came across, he demonstrated to this visitor, and the visitor was very, very enthusiastic and asked him to go to the UK to demonstrate it, and then he went to the US. When he got home, he did further work on it and actually developed a thing he called the egg, which is the first flight recorder. Australia had, I believe, what in those days, and I think still has, a branch office mentality, meaning all good things come from overseas, Europe, UK, US. So what happened when finally it was recognised by the powers that be that we did need a flight recorder on aircraft? They chose a US model, which didn't really work anyway. So that's one strand, is that sort of conservatism. How do we break that down, not only in business, in looking at accessing scientific information and using science and engineering knowledge, but also in government agencies? How do we break that down?
I think the question is about why does Australia not grab these opportunities more actively than it does?
The comment previously, which was the UK does it better than the Australia, and the US does it much, much better.
Yeah, I'm not sure that necessarily does, but it's certainly the case that Australia needs to do even better. Is it something to do with a lack of confidence? You seem to be implying that there's a lack of confidence. Australia doesn't need to have that lack of confidence. This is a great country with enormous resources, with a very skilled workforce, and if that's the case, that's a cultural thing that needs to change. Australia should be grabbing those opportunities. We have people who are producing all sorts of new discoveries. We should be developing them ourselves and applying them for social benefit and for economic prosperity. That goes back to the issue of impact investment, which I welcome enormously. Impact investment, if it means that our leaders of all of our organisations take responsibility for making sure that we're investing in things that not only lead to economic wealth, but also lead to improvements in social conditions, social progress, opportunities for all. That is as important to me as the economic prosperity. Australia, I think, is able to grab both of them and can do better than it does right now.
This is where I bring in the question, what did Henry Sutton do in Ballarat in 1885? To which the answer is he invented television. Trust me. Question over here.
So my question is actually for Mr. Turnbull or anybody else who would also like to comment. So Australia has some of the highest levels of private household debt in the world, which has mainly been used to bid up house prices. Do you believe high levels of private household debt creates any potential risks to our economy? And if so, what should the government be doing about it?
The answer is high levels of debt, whether it's for an individual, a business, or a country, create risk. One of the reasons we wouldn't say we were shaken but not shattered by the global financial crisis, and one of the reasons for that, we didn't go into recession, was because when we were evicted from office in 2007, we left the country with no net government debt at all and $45 billion of cash in the bank, and that was a big start. As you look at the European countries, for example, you go into a big global recession with a lot of debt, and you've got very little flexibility because obviously your debt's only going to increase and increase, and the more it increases, the less flexibility you have. So bottom line is, yes, too much debt is a risk. You talked about it being used to bid up housing. Look, I just want to repeat something you may have heard me say before. There has been so much work done on housing supply in Australia. I mean, it's been analysed to death. It's very clear what the problem is. We are not building enough dwellings or houses. When I say houses, I mean houses, apartments, you know what I mean, dwellings. We simply are not building enough, and we need to permit, allow more dwellings to be built. It is absolutely, quite categorically, a supply-side problem. So there's a bunch of reasons for that. If you look at our city of Sydney here, the developers will tell you that it takes typically 18 months to get a DA for a apartment development here, 6 months in Brisbane. Housing affordability is less of a problem in Brisbane because supply can respond to demand than it is in Sydney. So this is a big issue. This housing affordability is a really big issue, but the answer is build more dwellings.
Please, over there.
Hi, Gemma here from AAP. Mr. Turnbull, is sacrificing privacy through metadata retention laws a risk worth taking to combat terrorism?
Well, look, let me. Let's. It's a very loaded question, and the vast. Look, let's be quite clear about when we talk about metadata. It's a wretched term that nobody understands. I think we should just actually refer to call charge records, which is when you talk about metadata, what you're basically talking about, for the most part, is the call charge records that telcos keep, which is the A party, your number, the number you called, the time of call, the length of the call. If it's a mobile network, it may also record typically the location, the base station it was connected to. And of course the account name. Now the vast majority of the metadata access by the police is simply to find out who is the account holder of a phone. They see a record of a telephone number calling somewhere. They want to find out who that number belonged to. That is by far the most important inquiry. Yes, it is. Having access to that type of data, having access to being able to resolve the customer IP address to the account holder in an internet context is very important in dealing with in the investigation of terrorism. There's no doubt about that. But while that is very important, and I don't underestimate the importance of that or the importance of this type of data being accessed to combat child pornography and drug trafficking and so forth, it does go right across the board. Now, you've got to understand that these records, which are business records of telcos, have been accessed by the police and a whole host of agencies, including the RSPCA, which is a dog lover. I must say I do have concerns that we have taken the RSPCA off the list, but that's got to make tough decisions in government. So we've limited the access now to basically just the police and the security services and, ICAC and places like that. So we've reduced the number of people who get access to it. We've provided real oversight with the Ombudsman, the Parliamentary Committee. You've seen the special arrangements that have been made where metadata is sought in respect of a journalist to find out their source and so forth, with a warrant and public interest advocate. So if you compare the world of today, there is limited privacy protection. It's not without privacy protection. The consequence of this bill is significantly enhanced privacy protection and oversight. Now, if your position is that you don't want the police ever to be able to have access to this type of data, well, regrettably, I think most people would disagree with you. The melancholy but solemn duty of governments and parliaments is to often balance competing interests. So on the one hand, we have privacy, and on the other hand, we have security, and we're constantly balancing that. I think we've found the right balance here, and it is significant that we have bipartisan support for it. The government, the Liberal National Coalition and the Labor Party are united in supporting these changes. So I think it's definitely better, and I do think it is very important to ensure that our police, our security agencies are not left in a position where really important information and records that they need to investigate crime, including terrorism, but not obviously exclusively terrorism, it's important that that is retained and not put at risk. So there it is. I think it's definitely an improvement in the privacy direction, perhaps not as obviously as far as you'd like.
Time for two more questions, one over here and one over there.
I guess my question's relevant to the whole panel, I assume. Look, in the beginning of the evening, we were hearing about risk, how important it is to respond to risk wisely, appropriately, by taking into account the evidence. Yet, as the evening's gone on, of course, we've spoken about how perceptions are far more powerful than evidence, and as a psychologist, it's always of interest to me how actually psychology wins over facts 99% of the time, whatever statistic you want to use. And Sam's response to this was, well, we need conversation, we need diverse opinions and we need conversation. But the problem with that is that you need openness. And our zeitgeist at the moment is not openness. Our zeitgeist at the moment is to attack and to blame and not to have room for other opinions. And the other problem at the moment is, of course, is that vested interests have a much more powerful voice than the average person. They can put the ads on TV, they can run big campaigns, they can have Rupert Murdoch putting whatever he wants on his newspapers. And so for this conversation to happen, we can't have these two preconditions. And I wonder what the panel's thoughts are about how do we manage the perceptions of risk, of things like climate change or all these problems we've been discussing tonight. How do we manage that, given these two problems?
Sam.
I think it's a very wise question, and it's probably the ultimate challenge for how communities and societies do find ways to ensure that vested interests don't crowd out those voices that we need to hear. So it's a tough question. In climate change particularly, I wish psychologists and the social sciences had had deeper conversations or had a chance to converse with the hard scientists, the scientists who actually do the climate science, because I think we lost an extraordinary opportunity to converse about science, but using psychology and to understand the psychology of receipt of very hard news. I don't think we did that terribly well. So within the sciences, I always hope that the social sciences and the so-called hard sciences could collaborate more within their disciplines so that to understand how a message is communicated so it can get a much broader audience than simply the facts. Because we know whether it's economic facts or climate facts, bad news is hard to sell unless it's supported by, I guess, the vested interest. So we've all got to work harder, I think, they're not just conversations for the sake of them. They're not just soft things. These are very hard things that we need to subject ourselves to get better quality decision-making and outcomes. It's not a good answer. It's more to say...
Very good answer.
No, it's more to say we need to do more of this and we need to find those avenues. The conversation for me is not a soft alternative to hard decision-making. It's part of how we get rigorous decision-making and reliable decision-making, taking into account a broader set of evidence and understanding than simply listening to the loudest voices.
We've gone for an hour and a half. Final question over there.
We just had a reminder this morning, this morning's press, about a risk for Australia in terms of its population growth. The Australia Institute report talking about, for example, Sydney having, in the next 4 years, 500,000 growth in population, of which perhaps 60% might be overseas net migration. So my question is to any members of the panel, how do we, given that part of that risk is we're not having the discussion, how do we have that conversation so we have the proper planning and the wise planning for that?
You know, Fran Kelly put that very question to Mike Baird this morning, and Mike responded very openly and constructively, and he just said, look, yes, I regard that as a good thing, 500,000 people over that time frame, but we've got to build the infrastructure so that you can handle them. I mean, you know, density in cities is the solution, not the problem, but you've got to have the infrastructure that gives the amenity. And the problem that we've had in Sydney and in other cities as well is that we simply weren't building the infrastructure, whether it is mass transit, whether it is social infrastructure. There was just a failure to invest. And so what Mike Baird is doing, and with his, and you'll be the beneficiaries of it here when you get the light rail out to the University of New South Wales. What you're seeing is the investment in that type of infrastructure that will enable you to deal with that. So I think as a politician, when people complain to you about overdevelopment, what they're invariably complaining about is congestion. And that is the consequence of having more people, but not properly planned infrastructure, particularly transit infrastructure. So I think it's the only risk is that you get I would say there's a big risk that Mike isn't re-elected premier, but there is a risk that any government, I would say as a Liberal, there's a lot less risk I think if you want to mitigate risk, vote for Baird on Saturday. But the risk is that governments don't continue to invest, and it is absolutely critical. That's why infrastructure in cities is vital, and it's not just roads and rail. There's a lot of other things. What we're doing with telecommunications, with the broadband network and so forth is another example.
That was a final question from down here. There's one upstairs, and that'll be the absolutely final. No risk, please.
Thank you. I will try to be brief, but I'm aware that I would like to bring this back to climate change because this is an issue that affects me and my generation in a way that won't affect any of you on that panel. So, you see... So, you might see a number of people in the audience
Ask not for whom the bell tolls.
wearing orange squares tonight, and that's to support divestment. They joined the 150 academics and alumni who last year wrote to the previous Vice-Chancellor asking this university to divest, along with 78% of students and staff that responded yes to a vote for divestment on a non-biased forum conducted last semester. We've seen that governments have failed to address climate change, especially yours, Malcolm. It's appalling, quite frankly. I'm very concerned for the future. Yeah. And we've seen that we can't rely on the fossil fuel companies themselves to adequately regulate themselves. Carbon capture storage technologies are nowhere near at the capacity that we need to be able to have a sustainable planet for my grandchildren to live on. So how do you suggest that we actually address climate change in the very narrow time frame that we have? We can only burn 20% of the fossil fuels that we have in reserves. How do you suppose that we can address that without taking money out of the industry that is causing this problem?
Herbert, you have 1 minute.
Well, you won't, but seriously, divesting out of fossil fuel companies, if the university were to do that, it will not make... It is a gesture, it may be an important gesture, a statement, but it is not going to crimp the financial sales of the fossil fuel companies at all. I mean, the point that Sam Mostyn... No, but hang on. The point that... I agree with you, by the way, about carbon capture and storage. I think the CSIRO was a great proponent of it about 10 years ago, but what has become clear is that because of the sheer physicality of the process, the costs are much higher than were modelled back a decade or so ago. So I think it's fair to be very sceptical about that, but, who knows, some new technology...
Final point from Herbert Huppert, please.
But hang on, my only...
Can't hear you, please.
All right. Well, listen, let me put this to you. Let's say the university sells all its shares in fossil fuel companies tomorrow. So, fossil fuels are being used to power the lights in this auditorium. So what are we going to do? Are you going to forswear?
No, we can't afford this. No.
Okay.
Can we have...
Can I just say then a few words, since Robyn seems to be inviting me, and I'll speak as loudly as I can, for obvious reasons.
Good.
And I do know something about this because I was the chair of the working group that prepared a report on carbon capture and storage to the European President and Parliament last year. Part of what the young lady says is absolutely correct. If we keep on putting as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we're going to be in big trouble and irrevocable trouble in 20 or 30 years in the timescale of her grandson or granddaughter. There are efforts to do something about it, but it isn't easy. It's easy for us here in wonderful Australia, fabulous Sydney, to say, let's burn less fossil fuels. But what about if we lived in China? What about if we live in India, where that's an essential part of our energy, a minute amount of energy? But let me just say that the biggest mining company in the world, the third biggest company in the world, BHP Billiton, has a CEO of about 1 year now, and he is committed to reducing the emissions of BHP Billiton. I hope I can say this, the doors are closed, don't tell anybody else, but he wants to do more than that. The board at the moment is talking with him and there is some difficulty, but I think one can look rather favourably on BHP Billiton, who, with all respect, Vice-Chancellor, much bigger than the University of New South Wales.
How dare you?
Especially in this University of New South Wales building. You will see that you will be proud of what Andrew Mackenzie, the new CEO, will do with your biggest company.
They work together.
Robyn, if
Please, Merlin Crossley.
If I can just say that, isn't it great that we had that really lively, robust discussion? That's exactly what universities are all about, and that's why it's so great to have you here this evening. UNSW is absolutely committed to that sort of discussion, and we are starting a forum for discussion and debate on the grand challenges for society. This topic of climate change, renewable fuels, and divestment in fossil fuels will be a key topic for discussion, so we should continue that.
Thank you for that. It's becoming so much fun, I didn't want it to end. But as Dean, my job is to end things sometimes. So we will bring the evening to an end. My other job is to thank people. I do want to thank our participants tonight and the audience. UNSW is an extraordinary special place. We have mathematicians who can make people laugh, Herbert. We have business people who come to the Faculty of Science, Sam, and actually we reach out. We've started a new Bachelor of Science and Business to try to have students of the future who will be equally comfortable in science and business. We have at UNSW, it's been a great privilege to have you here, Malcolm Turnbull, Ministers of Communications who can and are prepared to communicate, which is fantastic. And the rarest of all, we have Vice-Chancellors at the University of New South Wales who are actually admired by their staff. So it's very good. And we also have radio commentators who are good in the limelight. So thank you, Robyn. And I want to thank our intelligent and passionate audience. You've been very good. Thank you for your questions. I apologise that we couldn't fit everyone's questions in, but thank you for coming, thank you for participating, and it's wonderful to see how you've managed to fit into the hall perfectly, the perfect sized audience as well. And thank you for my team who organised this. Thank you all. Good night.
Right. Very good.